Scorzo, and I'm joined with Lizzie Soden, and this is the Culture on the Offensive podcast, where both of us are going to be discussing some of the more interesting issues that have been popping up in today's zeitgeist and the kind of philosophical issues that they are raising. For those of you who don't already know, I'm the lead writer and chief editor for Culture on the Offensive. I also do talks where we go out into different parts of the country and ask you what you think about different issues. They're called The Art of Thinking. And I'm joined again by Lizzie Soden, who is the chief strategist for Culture on the Offensive and the development manager and one of our more interesting writers. So how are you today, Lizzie?
I'm okay. My head's a bit scrambled.
Is your head a bit scrambled because the world seems to be throwing out lots of issues that tend to scramble one's head?
Yeah.
Yes, I know how you feel.
Every 10 minutes things change at the moment within the news feed.
So one of the issues, or maybe the issue that's, getting the most coverage in the UK at the moment, which people seem to see as the most important issue, apart from the cultural spats that are happening, is Brexit and what's happening with Brexit in its latest implementation phase, if one might call it that.
Hang on, you've forgotten one very important piece of news.
Which is?
Prince Philip.
Oh, right. I forgot about that, yes.
Prince Philip had a car crash and nothing happened. And he didn't hurt himself. And he went for a checkup and he was all right. So, thank God for that, eh?
Well, it's important if, royals who have car crashes get reported on because they're more important than everybody else. Don't you know that?
Yeah.
Even when nothing bad happens to them, they're still more important than everybody else.
At least it took Brexit off the head slot for one day.
Yeah, that's one way of looking at it. Now, Brexit itself is in kind of an interesting phase at the moment because Theresa May just brought a deal which was supposed to be a compromise, but which in actual fact created conditions where the country was far worse off than it was remaining.
He couldn't make it up, really.
I mean, the country is far worse off according to her deal in the sense of being more subservient to the EU than it would have been if we had never had the referendum in the first place. Is that an accurate characterization, you think?
Yeah, and we'd still be paying money and they'd have the say over the backstop when that finished. And because it's trying to sort of create reasons for the unreasonable. The unreasonableness of what is going on in Westminster at the moment, you can't use logic to try and understand what they're doing. It just seems to be sort of hysteria and flapping around, things changing every 10 minutes, everybody in total panic. To watch from the outside, it just seems like a complete and utter shambles.
Do you think that this is because the public voted for something that nobody in Westminster, be they Labour or Conservative, really wholeheartedly believes in, and they're trying to bring it about, minimizing what they perceive to be calamitous implications of it, without sort of getting rid of the substance of what the vote was about, which they can't do?
Well, the interesting thing is some people in Parliament do want total Brexit. That's the supposed right of the Conservative Party.
You mean the Jacob Rees-Mogg type people?
Yeah, and Boris and what's his name? I don't know. They all look the same to me. They all sound the same. So you've got the sort of posh right-wing Tories, and you've also got within the Labour Party Lexiters, if you like, people who are very anti the EU, who never wanted to join the EU, and ironically, coming from that tradition is Jeremy Corbyn, because Tony Benn was one of those people who was very anti-EU. So you kind of see Corbyn, as leader of the Labour Party, having to sort of adopt the legislation from his party conference, but seeming very grumpy about it, because I'm not sure whether he really agrees with it.
What do you think of his latest strategy to only talk to Theresa May on the condition she removes the no-deal option from the table?
I don't know, beggars belief, really. I can't see the point of it. It's really, really important, if nothing else, that people actually get together and thrash something out bloody quickly. I can only see now that it's going to go to a sort of softest Brexit they can possibly do, because basically the majority of people in Parliament don't want Brexit. But the one thing they do have to do is communicate. They're all like hysterically floundering about and losing sleep about the fact that there might be a no deal, but they're not communicating either. So Jeremy Corbyn kind of doing this, and I'm quite a fan of Jeremy Corbyn in other respects, but him sort of saying, oh no, I'm not going to talk to her unless she takes no deal off the table. That is really letting down a lot of Labour constituents. It's ridiculous for all sorts of reasons in terms of negotiation. And it just seems like he's being obstructive. Now, the reason he's doing this is because he wants a general election. And, my view is that we should probably have a general election. We've also got the other crowd who want another referendum.
Right.
Another people's vote.
I say best out of 3.
I mean, right, my position was that when we were coming up to the vote for Brexit, I got really, really confused because it was so complicated. So I'd read all these different articles. I would see things from all different viewpoints, which is what I do. I tied myself in knots.
I did something similar.
I had extremely, I'm extremely critical of the EU as a sort of oligarchic organisation linked with globalisation and Goldman Sachs and neoliberal technocratic sort of politics. So I had, very critical of the EU. And I think this is the problem. People are kind of thinking we're leaving Europe. Like, we can't actually physically leave Europe. It doesn't mean we're not going to still be super close to Europe. Doesn't mean we're still not going to trade with Europe. It means we won't be part of the EU, which is basically a monetary organisation, which serves the interests of capital.
So in the end, what did you decide?
Well, I went backwards and forwards.
How did you vote in the referendum?
In the end, I voted Remain. And it was kind of up to the wire on midnight the night before. And on balance, I voted Remain. Partly because I could kind of foresee that it was going to be so complicated. And that if we stayed in, we could perhaps get some strong reforms because we'd threatened to leave. And also I can see that the EU is collapsing regardless of what Britain do.
So in retrospect, 2 to 3 years later, 2.5 years later, do you think that if we had stayed, we would have gotten those reforms? Or do you think the EU has shown its true colours as quite a strong, arming, powerful organisation that you can't, as Yanis Varoufakis would say, you cannot really change all that much?
Well, it was Yanis
Varoufakis
who actually swayed me into staying in the end, because he was like super, super critical, but in the end he was kind of thinking that as a project the EU should stay together in terms of bringing the countries together, in terms of
preventing the extreme
right. But ironically, now in Europe we see populism and, well, actually, see, this is the thing. People equate populism with the extreme right.
Yeah, well, one of the reasons that argument that he gave was never convincing to me was because what is called the far right today is too nebulous. It means anything that isn't progressive. So if you don't like feminism, if you don't think that there is a problem with systemic racism against people of color in Western English-speaking countries, if you value things like sovereignty and free speech,
and you want control over your borders,
yeah, people call you far right. So when I think of a far right, I think of like actual fascists and neo-Nazis and people who want white nationalism to be something like a cultural and institutional norm. And I can't see
racial superiority.
Yeah, and I can't see any of those people having a dominant voice in any of the Brexit campaigns. If anything, the Brexit campaigns seem less fascist and more liberal than the Remain campaigns tend to, in my opinion. What do you think?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because, you could say the populist parties within the EU, like in places like France, Italy, there's a lot more people who are sort of veering on the sort of white nationalist strain of politics. Whereas in England, you know, everyone's panicking about that, but, you know, UKIP's disappeared up its own arse. You know, the far right in England now has kind of diminished. The BNP, the EDL, you know, they're, in a way, I think this is a kind of bizarre thing, but because of the sort of highlighting of potential racism within the Brexit debate, people have got more vocal against it, and the sort of zeitgeist has become more anti-racist.
I don't actually think it has been anti-racist. I think it's been racist in the name of anti-racism. So you can say all kinds of incredibly racist and insulting things about white people and get away with it. You can even get published as an op-ed writer for The Guardian. But if you say anything which even insinuates that you might be in some subtle way or even some subconscious way racist against a person of colour like myself, then all hell breaks.
An example of that this week has been Diane Abbott appeared on Question Time. And Diane Abbott is the shadow foreign secretary. And by all accounts, she's not terribly good at it. Whenever she's sort of within the public sphere and she's interviewed, she's very pedantic. She seems to stick to the script. You know, she doesn't answer questions. She sidesteps. You know, and as a politician, I don't have much respect for her. I think she's pedantic, not really willing to listen, defensive, and not very articulate. Anyway, if I say that about anybody, any politician, you know, I have a right to say that. That's my opinion. But apparently if I say that about Diane Abbott, because she happens to be a black woman, I'm racist. Now, that is really, really patronising to Diane Abbott. Because it's like, what am I supposed to go, oh, yeah, you're great, really. All these things that you're really shit at. Oh, no, you know, are we supposed to treat her like a child and not upset her? So what happened was, she went on Question Time and the new chair of Question Time said something to sort of warm up the audience to the sort of, as far as I can work out, and I wasn't there, so to, you know, to sort of prompt the audience to give them a hard time. And she happened to mention Diane Abbott as one of the people. But she was really sort of geeing the audience up to give all of them a hard time, because that's what they're there for. But this was because she actually mentioned Diane Abbott, or something came out, and when Diane Abbott was evading questions, she pushed her really hard.
You're talking about the new host, Fiona Bruce, who's taken over from David Dimbleby on Question Time.
So she was interrupted quite a lot of times because she wasn't answering the questions. And she kept repeating the same thing. And Fiona Bruce was saying things like, yeah, we know that. You've already said that. So because she was giving her, you know, chairing, actually, Diane Abbott interpreted that as her being interrupted more than anybody else. The fact other people weren't interrupted was because they weren't repeating themselves. And she's now come out that this is racist. And the worst thing about this is that the Labour Party have said if she says it's racist, it is racist. Now this comes back to the sort of 80s, you know, pulling out the racial card stuff, which makes people really mad. You know, like Diane Abbott should be treated the same as everybody else, as an individual, and be, you know, stand scrutiny the same as anybody else and any other politician. You know, I thought Isabel Oakeshott was pretty twattish on that. I could give all sorts of reasons why. You know, I didn't really potentially like any of what they said, and I could be critical of lots of what they said, and if I was chairing it, I would probably push them on certain things.
Well, it's interesting. A Labour source has said, quote, Diane Abbott has been subjected to a serious, often racist and sexist campaign of hate and abuse. The way she was treated on Question Time was unacceptable and fed the hostility towards her. We expect, this is a different paragraph, we expect the program to correct inaccuracies, provide a full explanation of what happened during the show's production, and to apologize to Diane. They're also upset about a poll that was claimed to be a certain way that the Labour Party says is another way. But
yeah, that was this thing where Fiona Bruce said, "You're behind in the polls for an election," and apparently that isn't true. So her figures were wrong. But having said that, I have seen a poll which puts Labour behind.
So you don't think the figures were wrong, or do you think?
No, I've also seen polls that put, Labour in front, but she only cited the one.
Well, the difficulty with these kind of political
But
parties.
let's see what we think of polls anyway.
I know the difficulty with parties and polls is there's often a wide variety of different polls, and one party thinks that one poll is discredited, and another set of poll is the better poll, and the other party thinks the opposite, and they have a different set of polls that they think are the best ones.
No, they only like the poll which says they're in front.
Yeah.
The other ones must be rubbish. No.
But also it says in The Independent, quote, the row erupted after Miss Abbott claimed the show had legitimized racism against her and described her appearance, quote, as a horrible experience. Labour, now this is assuming that this is what Labour is saying, not Diane Abbott herself. Labour said she'd been interrupted 21 times during the show compared to 9 times for Mr. Stewart and 8 for the SNP's Kirsty Blackman.
That's like taking all responsibility off her. Like all the responsibility that she didn't answer questions and kept repeating what Labour's position on Brexit was, like a robot. It was like, so the responsibility for being interrupted was hers. I mean, I was watching it and I just thought, oh my God, she's just useless. Anyone who was doing what she was doing would have been interrupted that amount of times. The others weren't doing that. Now, the thing is, Diane Abbott, separate to this, has incurred on Twitter some really vile racist and sexist abuse, which has got nothing to do with her incompetency. We can call her incompetent, but that's got nothing to do with the colour of her skin or her gender. And it's, but this is happening all over Twitter. It's one of the sort of USPs of Twitter that people give people personal insults rather than, being critical of their ideas and judging their actions and behaviour. But it's horrible, whenever it happens. No one wants to see out and out racist abuse to anybody.
Mm-hmm.
However, you can't sort of conflate that, what she's having done to her by, a handful of dickheads, with however she's treated in any other public sphere must be the same as that.
It seems like there is a kind of philosophical divide between Brexit and Remain, which Westminster is trying to sort of underplay, or at least take the side of one half of rather than the other. So it seems like what Remain and soft Brexit have in common is it's possible to be a Remainer and say the EU is a corrupt technocratic institution, it's anti-democratic, there's very little that one can do to influence it, it's bad generally for, the Western world, but the economic hits and the bureaucracy of entangling our relationship would be just too high a cost to pay. So it's better to stay in the EU. That's a Remain position. Now, with the soft Brexit position, I can't really see anything too distinct from that Remain position.
No.
Because both of them are sort of accepting tacitly that it's better to stay in a corrupt, bureaucratic organization which is strong-arming the UK than risk the economic hit that would come from disentangling from it. Now, it seems to me that the soft Brexit position, because it's so close to Remain, it's difficult for me to conceptualize it as properly Brexit, because it's accepting what the Brexit campaign, was fundamentally rejecting, which is this idea that you should do what these internationalist organizations want you to do and be essentially bullied by them, because if you don't, your country will take an economic hit. So one of the things that Brexit seems to be about is...
It's actually blackmail.
Saying in a very principled way that you're willing to take on economic sacrifices in order to defeat what is essentially a bully who is strong-arming you, using the economy as a way of incentivizing you not to say no to them when they try and control you. It's kind of like an unhealthy relationship where, one partner threatens the other with, loss of money, or they might say something like, without me, you'll be homeless, so put up with whatever I do to you.
Yeah, I mean, it's more complicated than that. I mean, the no-deal option is weird The reason it's weird is because the argument for it is, you know, you have to be able to walk away. So if you go and buy a car, you know, and you offer 20 quid for the car and they say, no, I want 50 quid. Don't know where you get a car for 20 quid. You have to be able to walk away in order for them to back down. The thing is, this isn't an equivalent of that. People keep citing that as a reason why we need no deal. But the truth is, if we had no deal, we wouldn't just be back where we are. We wouldn't be in the same position we are. We would be in a massively different position, which has all sorts of unknowns linked to it. We wouldn't know what was going to happen with trade deals. We wouldn't know what was going to happen with customs. We wouldn't know what was going to happen with jobs. We wouldn't know what was going to happen with manufacturing. Everything would change. And that is really, really scary. People generally, human nature wants to keep the status quo. So, but the other issue is no deal doesn't mean no deal, because we would have to come up with some kind of deal after we've exited. We couldn't carry on, you know, we couldn't exit from the EU and have no trading deal with them ever again. And as has been pointed out, it's not in Europe's interest not to trade with us either. The risk we're taking is that we go through a period of time where people have lots of change and uncertainty, and trade agreements will have to be redrawn, and
we might have more austerity.
More austerity. And the thing is, or it could be that the European Union say, okay, you've left, but let's try and keep things the same until we come up with a proper deal.
Well, it seems to be fair. Like, there is the distinction between Europe and the EU, where it might be in Europe's interest to trade effectively with us, but it might be in the EU's interest to penalise and make this transition as difficult as possible to incentivize other countries.
They're worried about everyone jumping ship. That could be that German car manufacturers do a deal really quick with us because they sell so many cars to us individually, but I'm not sure if they can do that while they're members of the EU. So I must admit, it's very, very complicated.
Do you think it's fair that, in general, Brexit and the harder Brexit is represented as kind of a far right or hard right option, and Remain is sort of cast as the representation of the left generally, with the exception of, you know, Lexiters and so on?
No, I think it's ridiculous. I mean, you know, how many years ago? 5 years ago, there was a big Occupy movement against globalisation. And that was the left saying, you know, we want sovereignty. We want to take control over, localised control over things. We want to have a say over things that happen. We don't want it controlled by, you know, a global market. People were against the transatlantic trade agreement. And I think this is what's happening. The Remainers are sort of twisting things so that it appears that those people who want to leave the EU are nationalist, and therefore they link that with racism, and they don't want to be part of Europe, and they hate Europeans, and they want to kick them all out of the country. And yet when you talk to people who voted Brexit, that just isn't true. And a lot of people I've talked to, their key issue is sovereignty and having control over our own country, and trading with Europe still, and having people from Europe live here. You know, people are worried about free movement now. I mean, I'm not, but there are people worried about free movement, and that could be addressed in all sorts of ways. You know, we could leave the EU and choose to still have free movement with people who are outside of the EU as well.
Well, that's a different bureaucratic nightmare in its own right, how to figure out how that would work. But one thing that you brought up, which is interesting to talk about, is how the left, really in the last 5 years, has gotten on board the kind of neoliberal internationalist bandwagon. And I want to talk about why the left has gone for Remain so heavily, or at least the mainstream left has, instead of what you would expect, which is to go for Brexit, because after all, Brexit is like I guess you might say the left-wing position maybe of the mid to late 20th century. It's got various iconic left-wing figures like Tony Benn, who to his death was a Brexiter. So why have the left, you think, the mainstream left, become so suddenly tied to kind of neoliberal capitalist internationalist organizations like the EU and see anything which is trying to reestablish democracy and sovereignty at greater levels as a kind of threat to something.
Well, I don't like to come up with conspiracy theories, but all the Remainers say that the Brexit people were duped and fooled, and they didn't realise what they were voting for. But now I see Remainers having been duped and fooled. Their narrative that's been given to them is that Brexiters are racist and they want to kick everyone out of the country, and that they want to return to an old-fashioned Britain with cricket on the lawn, and they're all over 60 and they want to go backwards, not forwards, and we're now this super international cosmopolitan place. And so people go, oh, I want to be international and cosmopolitan, and I don't want to be seen like a bigot and a racist, and I don't want to be seen as going back in time. And so they're buying the narrative that those people who voted Brexit are like that, or thick and working class, which is so bad, that narrative. The way that people are talking about other human beings who voted Brexit from the left is just unbelievable. I saw something the other day about someone, a cartoon of someone saying they're taking our jobs. Says the lad with 2 O levels and been on the dole for years or something. So there is, they're kind of making the presumption that people who are moaning about their jobs being taken by immigrants wouldn't work anyway because they're thick and stupid.
Thick scroungers.
Thick scroungers, yeah. So the narratives that, the very, very wealthy Remainers who have big financial interests within the EU, they're kind of manipulating people to think, oh, I should be a Remainer, otherwise I'm a racist bigot.
There seems to be two kind of arguments. One which is happening in sort of the mainstream centre-left, and one which is happening on the far left, which seem to be doing what you're describing. So the one that's happening in the mainstream centre-left is this idea that the reason why internationalism is good, and we should give up some sovereignty, is that if you let the population decide what happens in all of our laws, the population will do things like bring back hanging, and they will do a very bad job of looking after minorities who they, in their natural state, oppress unless some state actor comes in and stops the population from having the capacity to oppress minorities via something like human rights law. And since human rights law is a big part of the EU and internationalist organizations, they see the internationalist organizations as being left-wing because they protect minorities from the populations of their own country. So that's what you're seeing in kind of the center-left. Now, in the far left, there's a similar argument against sovereignty, which is that sovereignty is incoherent because capitalism does not allow for anyone to have control of anything. Capitalism is inherently coercive. So if you leave the EU to go to the WTO, you're just leaving one set of coercion for another, because capitalism is inherently at odds with control and freedom and all the things that sovereignty presupposes. And they would rather go to the EU than the WTO because although they're both capitalist organizations, one is kind of progressive and interested in human rights and protecting minorities, and one isn't.
The irony is that...
What do you think of those two arguments?
Well, post-Brexit, we can decide our own laws. And if we want to have very stringent employment rights and we want to open our borders more to people who are non-EU, for example, or we want to create our own immigration rules, or, Jeremy Corbyn's going on about having, workers' rights, and, we can have workers' rights. We can choose our own paternity leave. We don't have to have that imposed on us by the EU. We can vote for a government who represents our viewpoints on that. So I don't understand why they kind of think, oh, all that will go away if we leave the EU. It might all go away if we have a conservative government that sort of looks after business.
It seems like what's going on here, though, is like there is such an importance placed on getting in the government you agree with, having the principles that you agree with become law, that you don't like democracy, because with democracy there's always the chance the other side can get in and have power. And people on the left today, it seems, don't really like democracy all that much, because democracy is a threat towards the uniform enforcement of what they think of as moral obligations. And they see as of late, every single political principle that they advocate is a kind of moral obligation, something for which there can be no debate. Do you see that?
Yeah, and just really authoritarian and anti-pluralistic. I mean, I've lived through Thatcher, which was hell. I disagreed with most of the things she did, and we fought against it, and she got defeated, albeit by a complete jerk. But, you have the opportunity with any government to protest, to vote them out, to stand for Parliament yourself, within a democracy. But there will be periods of time where you have government in power that you really disagree with at any given moment in time. And quite often the pendulum does swing. Now, what's interesting at the moment is that, it used to be pendulum swung from the left to the right, from left to the right. It kind of got a bit centrist for a couple of decades. But now the left and the right seem to have really gone. It seems to have changed now to sort of people who are into democracy and sovereignty and people who are into globalised economies and neoliberalism and progressivism.
Well, yeah, you're right. It does seem like what's happened is there is a kind of a version of far leftism, progressivism, which doesn't entirely encompass the whole of the left, because there are certainly many left-wing people who take issue with different progressive doctrines. But this kind of progressivism has kind of been something that it seems like both sides are sort of tacitly accepting as a sort of boundary of acceptable thought. So, you have Labour and the Tories debating about the extent to which we should slash the welfare state and things like that, and maybe privacy issues, but nobody is going to debate the elephant in the room, which is that progressivism has this really radical agenda about how the majority demographics in Western countries are oppressing minorities, and radical action needs to be done to rectify this, often action which winds up undermining or deflating important Western values and principles and laws like freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of conscience.
And undermining, the white population, who are the majority.
Well, it's certainly stereotyping them, saying they have an inability to empathize with identitarians.
And they're all racist.
Yeah, who make these really extreme demands of them.
I mean, it's awful, that they even talk about white privilege. Like, in Leicester, for example, the most unprivileged group is white boys within education. And within schools in Leicester, we're a white minority city. The focus has been on white working class boys within secondary education because they're the group that are achieving the least. It's, the Asian and the European population are achieving more. Now, you could argue that's because at one point the first generation immigrants who came over did get extra help and the white working class boys were kind of left behind. But anyway, I mean, I don't like racialising things. I think that what's happening is that we are trying to put people into groups and saying this group are this and this group are that, whereas we should be treating people as individuals and giving them the support they need within education. We should be looking at towns and cities which are outside London and looking at, the impact that deindustrialisation has had on them, the fact that there are no jobs. We need to be looking at the impact of the benefit changes that the Conservatives brought in. We need to look at the rise in homelessness. We need to look at the rise in child poverty. There's all sorts of things that are being sidelined by Brexit. And in fact, on the news the other day, I heard that there's been pension changes for those people on the lowest incomes so that they can't claim any pension credit, even though they've worked their whole lives, until the youngest of the couple hits pension age. It used to be that when you hit pension age, you would get your pension credit. But now you have to wait till your spouse also hits pension age. So that means you could have 5 or 6 years, if you've got a younger spouse, without getting credit that you've worked for and you've paid tax for. And again, this is big cuts on public spending, austerity, and they're sneaking all this stuff through while they're worrying about a full stop and a capital letter on some Brexit agreement.
But wait a minute, though. What would you say to the argument that the public voted for Brexit because they were willing to make the kind of economic sacrifices that involve more austerity and less welfare state and less social spending?
I don't think they did. I think they wanted to have a say over things. I mean, I know people who voted because austerity is being imposed across the EU. And, the banking crisis was linked to global economy and it impacted us. And
well, we should say, though, that the austerity as non-negotiable obligation, that wasn't for England. That was for countries that were in the euro.
Yeah, but I mean, it was a sort of EU idea.
Well, it was part of the EU's economic philosophy.
Yeah.
That they wanted to promote amongst its members.
And, they devastated whole countries with their policies.
Well, what would you say to the argument that in Britain we didn't actually have austerity? We had decelerated spending.
We had massive cuts in public services. And there's no two ways about that. We've had cuts in social services, care, health, education, housing, any way you look at it. Now, it might not necessarily be cuts. It might be that our population has increased. I know that in areas where there was high immigration, originally there was an immigration extra payment for those areas in order to cover schools and the impact that increased immigration would have on schools and health services and stuff. And then they took that payment away. So, suddenly doctor surgeries and schools were overcrowded, and it was by EU citizens. And there was no housing, and you'd have people not being able to find anywhere to live, and rents going up. And so there was a massive impact in certain areas by sort of the free movement and the increase in immigration that happened all of a sudden, and no spending was kind of put aside for the impact it would have.
What would you say to the argument that when people talk about, austerity and social spending and homelessness, this is kind of like a Labour Party Jedi mind trick? Because what they really mean is that what causes these things are the absence of increased social spending, the absence of the welfare state. When in reality, what causes them is the lack of investment in certain communities and the lack of capitalism, not the lack of the welfare state. What would you say to that objection?
No, there has been massive underinvestment in certain areas of Britain. Britain runs now on a banking economy, on the financial industry. Any other industry has been depleted, and so it all centres around London, and London grows and grows and grows and gets richer and richer. And there isn't any banking industry in Cleethorpes.
But what would you say to the argument that insofar as London gets richer, that actually aids the problems like homelessness and deprivation? Because when more power, financial power, concentrates in a certain sector or with a certain corporation, that means there's more jobs. There are more things for people to do in the community. So that ipso facto creates economic regeneration.
Well, it doesn't create economic regeneration except for the rich. I mean, you live in London, for example, and obviously they still need people to drive buses, to be nurses, to be teachers. But they can't, because there's a lot of property investment in London, and house prices have increased by 140% or something ridiculous in the last 5 years. They're pricing out many people from living in London. Those people who are living there are like in real massive financial, barely surviving. So you have this sort of paradox where you want to go to London because there's work there, but you can't afford to live there. So, then you have gentrification of areas that were working class, where there was social housing that have been bought up and turned into luxury apartments. We're sort of veering away here from Brexit, but I think these issues are sort of all not being dealt with while Parliament are disappearing up their own arse, trying to not Brexit.
So is your view that social decay is directly correlated with decreased social spending, the kind of Labour Party idea of how the economy works? Do you think that's correct?
I think there's an element of social spending. I'm not into the nanny state. There should be targeted social spending. especially in areas like healthcare, care for elderly care, education. There's a lot of waste. There was a lot of waste in public spending. But I think it's investment in cities and areas outside London and in new industry, which has been the problem.
Do you think at least some of the problems in London are caused by too much government restructuring of the economy? So, for instance, if you artificially make houses and flats more inexpensive, more people rent them who don't need them, and then the only flats and apartments that are left, the only houses and flats that are left are the really expensive ones. And that's what explains the housing crisis rather than, greedy landlords.
No, I think greedy landlords, the whole buy-to-let scheme, they would turn a whole family house into like 12 tiny little flats. So they'd get loads more money per square foot. They'd rent out to students, so they get more money per square foot. They'd build, if they were building, they'd build luxury apartments so that, per square foot they could charge more. So social housing has just basically been decimated. So affordable rents, it's to do with priorities, really. And, since the sort of dearth of social housing, they've priced people out of the market. And now so many more people can't buy houses and they're renting, and they're having to rent in the private sector.
What would you say to the argument that the reason the landlords are giving those high prices is not because, or the reason the landlords are pricing things that highly is not because they're greedy, but because those are the only prices that allow you to turn a profit which is sufficient enough to keep going?
Yeah, because the houses are expensive. But a lot of those landlords have bought those houses really cheap initially.
But is the problem
making a fucking fortune?
But is the problem greed, or is the problem with the economic structure inherently incentivizing you to charge people more than what is ethical, or else you go bust?
You don't go bust. These people have bought up a load of houses in East London on the back of knowing that and gentrified them and charged 5 times the rent that they used to. They've kicked out people who used to live there and rented them out to people from the city. There's absolutely, no two ways about it that, London has now become a place which only the super rich can live in, really.
Well, it depends what part of London, I suppose.
Yeah, unless you live in a really shitty area. But even in the shitty area, a 1-bedroom flat would be at least £1,000 a month.
Mm-hmm.
In a shitty area.
Yeah. Well, I suspect I wouldn't want to live in London on the income that we both live on.
We couldn't.
We couldn't, but I'm sure there's somebody out there who can tell us that they've done it, and there's a lot that London has to offer that we are completely unaware of. So I have agnosticism about London officially, because every time I say something bad about it, someone says you're being ignorant or you're not taking into account this, that, and the other.
No, I don't think that's true. I'm a Londoner. Basically, there are more jobs there, but there's a lot more competition, and you're, 1 in a million instead of being unique.
So what's interesting about this kind of deeply competitive capitalist environment that we have in London, which you see also in major cities of the Western world, is on the one hand, it seems to not really want to restructure the economy in some sort of socialist fashion or some leftist fashion, but it's sort of, when it comes to identity politics, it's almost to a greater extent than smaller communities really internalizing, mainstream feminism and mainstream anti-racism. One of the things that we saw the other day is a shaving ad for Gillette, where they're trying to sell you razors, but they're doing so by sort of giving you a montage of men behaving badly, being corrected by other men. And the inference of the advert is that men are sort of responsible, or in some ways complicit, in male criminality and predation, because masculinity is inherently toxic, and because of Me Too, men now have a social obligation to completely rid their gender of criminality and predation in ways that, women do not. So I was curious, what do you think of this new ad? You've seen it, we watched it together, and,
I thought it was a sort of feminist parody when I saw it, and I was laughing because I thought that's really good. That's taking the piss. And then I realised it was serious.
It does seem like a 2011 satire.
I thought it was something off Chris Morris.
It does seem like Chris Morris, doesn't it? Like brass eye.
Especially when the two kids are like rolling around on the floor, two boys. And the guy goes up and goes, "Hey, you shouldn't treat each other like that. These are boys playing." Like my kids used to kick the shit out of each other, and they were a boy and a girl. But they would fight like that. Like, you know, it's... Well, the message of it, again, with this identity politics thing, you know, go back to Diane Abbott. You know, you can't treat a whole demographic group. You have to treat them differently. You know, we're saying that men... You know, I can't even go there. It's like 50% of the population, they're inherently evil because a small group of them are criminals.
I don't think it's saying that. I think it's saying that 50% of the population should feel guilt for the criminals because they have in some way...
Because they've got penises as
no,
well.
because they have in some way enabled or excused the criminality and predation by either looking the other way or saying things like boys will be boys. That seems to be the attitude.
But the thing is, they're kind of against the sort of archetypal testosterone masculine traits. Yet they're all quite happy to walk past men digging the roads or security guards or bouncers or soldiers or miners or steel workers or, you know, anything which actually needs those male traits, which women aren't particularly interested in equality.
How dare you say that?
They don't want to do deep sea fishing.
To the same degree that
or
men do.
Or work on oil rigs.
That's like progressive sexism 101, what you just said there, Lizzie.
But, you know, they... So that sort of masculinity, the salt of the earth. I mean, I watch DIY SOS and I see those guys who are all, you know, real blokes doing incredible things. You know, they're soft as shit and they'll do anything and they're really nice guys and they'll give up all their time and all their money and put money into building a house for a family that are having a difficult time, and they're all in tears at the end. You know, but these are seen as men, you know, as people who have this toxic masculinity. They're all the same.
Well, there is an implicit connection between sort of stereotypically masculine behaviors, like, you know, being competitive or being more aggressive than women, and this sort of criminality within men and predation within men. And supposedly this criminality and predation exists, and it's a political problem because everybody else enables it or turns the other way.
Well, people are demonising heterosexuality now. I mean, within the middle classes, and, you know, this is such a middle class thing. Girls dressing up and wanting to be fancied and chatting up boys and playing the game and having the dance, playing hard to get, teasing, you know, all that sort of flirting, you know, men and women fancying each other, and making mistakes and making unwanted sexual advances and being rejected and all that messiness that comes with, you know, especially when you're young, with your first goes at making. That's now seen as like terrible, terrible behaviour, and mistakes can never be made, and everything's got to be totally controlled, and everyone's gone really prudish, and also young girls can't cope with someone unwanted sexual advances, and because they're poor little flowers, and, you know, can never be hurt, and sex hurts you, and, you know, there's all this. It feels like we've gone back to sort of Mary Whitehouse. So going back to the Gillette advert, you know, it's kind of saying that, you know, if men rough and tumble, or they appreciate how a woman looks because they look at her as she walks by because they happen to be heterosexual, or they bully each other, you know, at school. I mean, that's a really difficult one because obviously, you know...
Girls don't bully?
Yeah, exactly. Girls are the biggest bullies ever.
Well, there is, I think, there's something important to talk about with the Gillette advert, which is it rests on this idea that people don't question, which is men are generally the gender that messes about with the other gender and is not nice to them. whereas women are generally the gender that is nice and innocent and would never hurt men.
Yeah.
And it's not true. But the reason it looks true is because men commit crimes more and commit sexual violence more in a way where it's easy to tally on statistical reports. And it's easier to talk about how violence is largely male violence, how sexual violence is largely male on female, even though most men don't do it.
Yeah, women never get pregnant on purpose.
But what that doesn't really go into satisfactorily is the fact that although women who are criminals and predators are less likely to do the things that men do, i.e. violence and sexual violence, because they have less amounts of upper body strength and testosterone, female criminals do psychological violence to people. Psychological violence, which is A, much more difficult to tally in police reports or to get sympathy when you complain about, and B, psychological violence from women is something that men are socialized to see as something that makes them a wimp if they complain about. So we don't have evidence that
and they
one
have
gender.
the sexual power.
Yeah, so we don't have evidence that one gender is nice and one gender is generally not nice to the other.
Now, here's the thing: there are dicks in the world, and there are really horrible people in the world. And again, you have to treat people not by their gender but by their character, and you will get nasty people who are mean and abusive and manipulative and psychopathic, and and they come from both genders, but we act as if one gender doesn't have anyone who has any of those traits in it,
or that when a man is being annoying, that this kind of annoying behavior is on a continuum with sexual violence. That's something you see in the Gillette ad, where there's a scene where there's a boardroom presentation where the woman speaks and the man sort of puts his hand on her back and speaks for her, so it's mansplaining. So there's this connection between like being condescending as a man and being the sort of man who oppresses women or enables other men to rape and beat women.
Now, all the bosses I've ever had that have been the most horrible have been women.
Whereas you don't see like female condescension as a political problem because it's on a continuum with like female psychic violence.
No, they see it as women, bossy women who intimidate men and all the rest of it, are seen as redressing the balance. It's all about revenge. It's like, well, you used to do this to us, and so now we're going to be really horrible to you.
I'm not sure I buy I don't know how you feel about this, but I'm not sure I buy the narrative that the problem has been that men were like the upper classes and women were like the lower classes, and that's why gender equality was good and why we're still not done with it. I don't think that's really how it ever was, because there's too much stuff, even in the olden times, where in exchange for having less rights than men, women also got special protections that men did not get. And they got excused from having certain responsibilities that men did not get excused from. So I'm not really sure I buy this argument that Western society has ever been the kind of patriarchy where men benefit at the expense of women from the social norms, rather than as a society where, because of gender, both men and women have different sacrifices they're expected to make, and they also have different benefits.
The difficulty women had was no contraception. So if there was sex involved, they had babies and were often left holding the babies, or were often left shamed. And, because the way that they tried to stop babies happening was to say that sex was disgusting and horrible, and women who had it were harlots and slags, and if they were left with a baby, they had to give the baby up.
But now that those words are like offensive, harlot and slag.
Yeah, but and that was awful. But come contraception, women had the same freedom as men to have sex, and so that changed, and they didn't have the shame, and we had sexual liberation. But this is all very early days for the ability for men and women to be able to do the same things, the ability for men and women to be able to do the same jobs. And the thing is, there are differences between men and women. There are biological differences in the fact that we have different hormones surging around our bodies. The fact that we can actually have children and men can't means we have physical differences.
Well, there is a presumption in the left today, whether we're talking about the progressive or the far left, And that is, if there's any kind of inequality of outcome, if any two populations do things at different rates or succeed at different rates, this is de facto oppression.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, again, you have to treat people as individuals. There's now more women in higher education. There's more women in certain professions, like medical profession. There's more in under 35s. I think women are earning more than men. There's more women choosing not to have children. Things are changing, but they're not going to change overnight. And there will never be an equal amount of men and women doing the same thing, because there's not an equal amount of any two people doing the same thing.
Well, there is an attempt in the name of diversity to try and restructure working environments with special quotas so that you do get men and women equally represented in every profession. What do you think about that?
Well, like I said, they ain't going to be digging roads, are they? With big fuck-off drills and having horrible jobs. Like, did you see those guys who had to go down and break up that in the drains and break up that
the giant shit rock?
Yeah, the shit rock. It's like, oh yeah, let's have equality. We want to join. There's.
Well, do you want to be drafted into war? I mean, there's all these ways in which.
I mean, some women want to be soldiers, and they are. There's more women who are soldiers now. There's more equality, but
there's, I mean, even in the realm of sex, where supposedly our establishment has decided that men have the power, even there, like, there are so many social norms where it seems like men have so many more responsibilities than women. So, you have a responsibility as a man to make sure that your partner isn't drunk. It's not clear that you have that responsibility if you're a female. I've never seen any campaign to try and put women in prison for having sex with drunken men. Have you? And there's also all this responsibility you have to make sure that even if your female partner has said yes, she's consenting to a consensual sex act, you've got to look behind her words, look for behavior which might suggest that maybe she didn't consent after all. Whereas there's no kind of social pressure on women to look at a man who says, yes, I'll go down on you. And then while he's going down on you, to look at his face for, signs that maybe he's ambivalent about going down on you, and maybe he might retrospectively regret having gone down on you. There's nothing like that sort of set of pressures for women.
I just think most people ignore this shit. The people who get all upset about this are this sort of the new equivalent of the Mary Whitehouse Brigade. They're prudish, they're moral majority, they've kind of replaced religion with these kind of new sacrilegious teachings. And it's a sort of form of social control, which is insipid and insidious. But I don't know any young people who take much notice of it. I think...
Oh, I do.
Yeah, but a certain type of young person who's vocal and gives a shit. Most people don't give a shit and they get on with it. And most people, if you actually talk to them out of the sort of digital sphere, all of them think it's ridiculous. I've not met anyone who goes, yeah, that's all a very good idea. Not when they really think about it. It just seems to be like human nature that there'll always be the church or the feminists or the, people who all band together, and the ideologues, basically, who will try and preach their moral superiority over other people. And it does sort of leak into the zeitgeist. But even within the Catholic Church, for example, they had their teachings and they were very vocal, but a lot of Catholic families I knew, they weren't supposed to use contraception, but they did. They used to sort of pick and choose what the Pope said. See, they wouldn't there were sort of moral guidelines, I guess, and they wouldn't tell a priest things that they knew they'd get in trouble for.
Do you think a lot of the new progressive politics, whether it's feministy or anti-racist or trans politics, whatever, it's about forcing people to kind of do these symbolic gestures, which show that they are showing solidarity with a group?
It's religious thinking.
But when it's so focused on the symbolic gesture, it's almost like it's taking precedence over what people actually think and believe and whether they're actually bigoted or not. It's almost like it doesn't matter whether you feel black people are inferior. What matters is that you don't use the N-word. As long as you show solidarity with all of our anti-racist symbols, you can, in your own head, believe whatever bigoted things that you want.
Yeah, but that's sort of human. I think that's how societies kind of organise themselves. It kind of happens organically, kind of. And I think, the breakdown of religion and the rise of secularism has sort of created this void and in a sort of moral vacuum, and the ideologues have come in and filled that vacuum because it feels like they feel insecure if they don't have sort of moral virtues in which to control people.
So does progressivism to you feel like a religion, like a new secular kind of religion?
Absolutely. I think it's, if you broke down their sort of the way they operate, the way they work, I want to say progressivism in inverted commas here, but the sort of new moral majority, if you like.
The capitalist intersectionals.
Yeah. Intersectionality is like a religion. None of it makes any sense any more than saying that there's a bloke in the sky looking down and watching us all the time. It's just made up shit, really. But if you look at things through those lenses, it's there's plenty of sinners you can find, including Fiona Bruce, who interrupted Diane Abbott because she wasn't answering the question.
Well, the idea of offensive language is kind of similar to blasphemous language.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, you can't say this, you can't say that. And, I can remember being at work in the 80s and saying, oh, Christ, and offending this woman in the office who was religious and being told off. Maybe it's just something that humans do. There's always some that sort of get outraged. It's like in their temperament to be outraged, and they find something to be outraged about, and then they all organise together to create rules that people can break, and then they can be outraged about.
Well, what seems to be the kind of common theme about progressivist outrage is they're outraged over stuff that you would think most people would not be outraged by.
I don't think most people are.
I mean, like, it makes sense that you would be outraged by being told you can't apply for a job because of the color of your skin.
Or because of your gender.
Yeah, it makes sense that you would be outraged about, being a slave. Or it makes sense that you would be outraged at being laid off and not having any recourse to benefits or anything like that, and there being no jobs in your area. But it doesn't make a lot of sense that most people would be outraged by the fact that, when you walk down a high street, like, most of the adverts are, contain mostly white people. Or if you look at a clothing shop for girls, it's mostly female gendered clothing rather than the absence of gender.
Well,
I mean, these sort of things that they really get upset by, they don't seem like things that most people would be upset by.
No, the thing is, they don't seem to look at the fact that some things may be inherent in our... I mean, it's almost horrendous to say this, but inherent in our biological makeups. That, women like dressing up more than men, putting on makeup. Not all women, but if you sort of look at the whole population of women and men, you'll find more women that want to do that. Now, the thing is, as individuals, any individual should be able to dress as they want, put on makeup, wear what they want, but you find less men want to do that. And nowadays, they could if they wanted. No one's going to bat an eyelid in the way that they used to. Having said that, in the 70s, no one batted an eyelid. They just thought it was gender benders. But
well, there does seem to be a change. Like, in the past, even when I was a kid, liberation was identified with being able to be an eccentric and not be persecuted. Whereas today, the progressive idea of liberation is that when you are eccentric, you are validated. Everybody else must tell you how great you are, and you must be seen at the same level or the same frequency with which non-eccentrics are in adverts and TV shows and board meetings. I mean, if you're upset about the absence of validation because you're an eccentric, it doesn't seem to me that you are representative of most people or most eccentrics. So it's almost like
eccentric in its very nature is someone who doesn't fit in, who wants to shock.
It's almost like they're drunk on power that comes from displaying to other people how angry they are. Because when they display the anger, changes happen, especially if it's online anger. But
this is a digital age phenomenon, I think.
But the anger that they feel is not the anger a sane person would feel. It's anger over having an expectation, having a set of expectations for the world that is way too high.
Way too high. And ridiculously irrational. I mean, thinking back, Mary Whitehouse and her campaign, she was a good Christian lady and she didn't want to see filth on television. She didn't want people to swear. She didn't want to see sex. She didn't want to see violence. And she had this campaign against the BBC. But her exposure was on the BBC. She would be interviewed and she would be on programmes like Question Time. And she would be in the newspaper. And now, if Mary Whitehouse was around now, she could Twitter storm anyone. She could, which is basically what's happening with the new progressives. They've got so much more access to shutting people down and having power than Mary Whitehouse did.
I know they complain about rich capitalists having, power-hungry attitudes, but the people in this decade who seem to be making the most amount of cultural change are people that are totally drunk on power. When it comes to the power of saying you're angry at something and then having someone else be so scared of you that they comply with your demands without even having a discussion. And you can express as part of your anger, this is something which is so morally important, there should be no discussion.
This to me comes back to what we were saying about Brexit, that people are kind of manipulated by this way of thinking, in that nobody wants to be judged to be discriminatory or prejudiced or racist or... ironically, people generally don't want to be sexist, racist. They want to be seen as good people. They are good people. They're human beings. They want to get on with fellow human beings. They don't, want to be mean and nasty. But there are some people who will always be mean and nasty. But the way that this is being handled is it's like, if you don't virtue signal that you aren't racist or sexist, then you are definitely racist or sexist. And you have to perform these rituals to prove. And if you have any doubts about this narrative, then you're a bigot. And we're not the bigots who are imposing this on you.
It's you.
It's you. And it's kind of like Alice Through the Looking Glass stuff. It's Orwellian. It's like...
It's projection.
Yeah, it's projection. Yeah. And this is how they... I don't like to say that people are blindly manipulated, but the narratives, that people... I think a lot of people don't think about it because it just kind of feels right. Oh, yeah, I'm not going to be horrible to someone who's transsexual. I don't want to be nasty to them.
I'll call them Zer if they want to be called Zer.
Yeah.
And if Chuck Norris wants to use the women's toilet and doesn't want to change anything about himself and call himself Chuck and have a penis and a hairy flat stomach and all the rest of it, he should be able to do that. If a woman looks at him and makes him uncomfortable, she should be the one who gets scolded and kicked out of the bathroom, not Chuck Norris. Oh, and I'm sorry, Chuck Norris, I meant she, not him.
Yeah. But I think that I don't think many people think this, but I think...
They go along with it because they don't think about what the implications of what they're going along with is.
No, they go along with it because they're actually quite okay people who aren't really bothered.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, most people go along with the trans bathroom issue because they think, okay, they imagine this transgender woman who looks female, who goes into the bathroom, who's told, you have a low voice or something, get out of here. What they don't imagine is Chuck Norris going into the female bathroom and saying, I'm a woman.
But this is, I do have worries about this because these are very, very rare cases. Most
but
trans
the politics
people,
are about accommodating these really bizarre cases,
but
rather
I don't
than
think there are many bizarre cases.
But in a way, though, doesn't it matter more that like the ideology is being ramroded down people's throat in a way where they can't even have time to notice how extreme it is?
Ideology, per se, adopted like in a religion, the risk you take is that you will get extreme cases like Chuck Norris, you know, and most of the time it's probably not extreme, you know, and most people who look like men don't identify as girls. You know, there's probably very few, and they probably would, if they were in a club, wouldn't use the or demand to use the women's toilets. But you will always find an extremist case, and this is the problem with any kind of ideological stance or political stance. You know, you risk idiots exploiting the rules, if you like.
Well, it does seem, though, that the trans activist stance today, though, is that if you have a problem with Chuck Norris...
Yeah, but the trans activists are probably a very small minority, but we're going back to this whole notion of the...
Exactly, but their point is that for this small minority...
they've got a big voice.
You should do what they say. And if you have a problem with Chuck Norris in the women's bathroom, if Chuck Norris identifies as a woman... that means you're the one who needs to be scolded.
No, they use emotional blackmail in a really, really insipid, horrible way, you know. And they, in the same way that the Remainers are using emotional blackmail against Brexiters. You know, they label anyone who doesn't follow their viewpoint and disagrees with them. They just label them bigots. Racists, sexists, Nazis. It's total irrationality in the face of uncertainty. So if you looked at it in terms of a psychological state of mind that the country's in, when anyone faces uncertainty, what do you crave? You crave certainty. You want to know where you stand. You don't want to know, you want to know what's going to happen. And everyone's scrabbling around trying to find certainty, and you know, I don't know what to think about this because this is really complicated. So I want an answer. I want you to tell me what I'm supposed to think, and then I'll feel safe. And then I've got certainty. And because there's so much zeitgeist shift and everything's kind of been thrown up into the air in this massive volcano, and everyone's waiting for the lava to come back down again, you know, people are really grabbing onto this totally irrational explanations for actually very normal human paradoxes that we deal with all the time. It's almost like they don't want anything to be messy. They want everything to make them feel like they know what's happening. So
it seems like the kind of the big theme in progressivism, which maybe separates it from the left that I grew up with, and maybe the left to a larger extent that you grew up with, is the left today, whether it's the far left or whether it's the progressive left, and, you know, all the shades in between, it seems to have an ethos which is all about control rather than freedom.
Yeah, but the interesting thing as well, it's about division.
Division and control.
And authoritarianism.
Mm-hmm.
It's really bizarre. I mean, again, you could say, you know, the neoliberal establishment, the global economic elite, are sort of dividing the workers, if you like. You know, they're turning everyone against each other, and sort of, rather than treating them as individuals to be judged by their character and having sort of equal rights as individuals, they're kind of dividing everybody up and making them fight amongst each other.
So do you think this is a tribalistic age?
It is, and it's a very strange beast, and it's something that we're going to have to get our heads around. I remember in the late 90s I went to a conference about the internet, and people were talking about how new communities would be established and you could meet people like you, you know, so...
And you never thought they meant new warring communities.
Yeah, I never thought they'd mean new tribes, but, you know, so it'd be like, oh, you know, if you go to a pub, you'd meet people from all different walks of life, and then you might find someone else who's into the same music as you. Or you might go to a record shop, and as you're looking through, or there might be a cafe where certain people go who listen to certain records. And, you know, so you had to kind of find your tribe, but you had to put effort into it. But also a lot of your life was spent with people who didn't think the same way as you, who were eclectic. The whole, you know, pub scene was, you know, you'd get old blokes in there, you'd get students, you'd get families, you'd get all different people, especially if you went down your local. But now people can kind of, you know, this is the weird thing about progressive. You don't actually have to talk to anyone you don't agree with. You can find your own tribe and prop up each other's
and you can insult,
delusions.
Yeah, you can insult those people on your phone and that's it.
Yeah. And you can prop up each other's delusions and sort of go, yeah, we're the best, we're the best. Sort of create a feeling of superiority and say the way we think is the only way to think. And you have a lot of power to influence in a way that you never did have before. And yet, offline, most people would agree it's all really stupid. And they don't agree with the sort of online activism. And they don't like Twitter. And most people who are sensible don't go on Twitter.
Do you worry that most people are not exactly supporting progressivism, but they just kind of go along with it because they think, well, that's what you do today? Like,
yeah. But I think a lot of people aren't extreme about it. You know, I think a lot of people, going from the sort of struggles we went through with women's liberation, with gay liberation, with civil rights movement, with anti-racism.
all of that which we still support now.
Yeah, because we went through all that, people generally became more tolerant and didn't judge people. You know, they took people as they found them, as my gran used to say. You know, everyone was trundling on all right. But then it was almost like, well, now no one's really discriminating generally against anyone and everyone's okay. Even, you know, my ex-husband's strict Catholic family were quite happy that one of their nephews was gay and he came and got married and brought his boyfriend to the Christmas do. You know, whereas when I first knew them, they thought homosexuality was disgusting.
Yeah, if you think homosexuality is bad, or you're anti-choice, or any of these things that are sort of seen as like the hallmarks of the right, you're not in the social norm, you're outside the social norm.
Yeah. So I think, you know, people kind of go, yeah, I don't care if you're a tranny or not. That's
well, they
fine.
wouldn't say tranny because that word is highly offensive.
Oh, is it?
Yes.
Oh, God. See, I can't even keep up. I'm off the gay scene, I don't know. Trannies are all...
Yeah, I'm sorry, but your experience on the gay scene, that was the 2001 gay scene, not the 2019 gay scene.
Oh, God, I don't know.
Well, on that note, I think that's it.
Yeah.